All right, love and light, peace and blessings. Welcome back to the official or the second week of the official podcast of Through Healing Eyes. I am your host, Harlow Hendricks. Just want to take an opportunity to thank everyone who took their time to listen to our podcast last week. It was our debut podcast, and I was really excited. I do appreciate those who took the time to listen, and of course, those of you who sent me some feedback. The great thing about this is that as you grow, you evolve, and that's what we're going to be seeing moving forward. I want this podcast to be everything that it needs to be so that it can reach as many people as it can. So before we jump into our subject matter for today, which is going to be ego death or ego drop, I just want to make sure that you can reach us on all social media platforms if you're looking to hang out with us outside the podcast. So through Healing Eyes, we have a Facebook page. Also has a great Facebook group and healing circle. If you'd love to join that, feel free to do so. Check us out again on Through Healing Eyes and Facebook. We're also on Instagram and TikTok. There's an X out there page for Through Healing Eyes, but it doesn't have a lot of activity right now. But if you are an X enthusiast, be sure to check us out on X as well, which is formerly known as Twitter. All right, so let's go ahead and jump into today's subject matter again, which I said is going to be ego drop, and I'm super excited. If you've been talking to me outside in the real world, IRL, then you probably know I'm totally into ego death, ego drop, and it's new to me. I'm not going to front. This is something that is really new to me that has I've become aware of in the last few months, and I think I'm just like an overkill on like sharing it with everyone and just kind of getting everyone to understand what the ego death is. So anyway, this is kind of where my head's been at, my heart's been at, and I definitely want to do a podcast. I did host a healing circle on this a few weeks back, and I think that I was able to relay some good information to those that joined. So I'm going to go ahead and try to relay some of that same information today in this podcast. So we're going to talk about a couple of things. We're going to talk about what exactly the ego death is. We're going to talk about how it affects us. We're going to talk about how we benefit from ego death. And if you haven't heard of an ego death, this is a good place to start. If you have, please feel free to send me your feedback and insight on some things that I might have missed regarding the ego death. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. And we're going to talk again about what it is. So, an ego, let's talk about the ego first. You know what? Actually, I'm going to backtrack. I want to go over my intentions. My intentions today with this podcast, for one, is to help everyone embrace some sort of vulnerability. This podcast and any kind of one-on-one contact or any group contact or interactions that you have with Through Healing Eyes, it is a safe space. So feel free to share without judgment anything that you might be going through. And again, that's when you connect with us through our social media platform, or you want to get with me one-on-one, you can definitely do that. I want to cultivate also self-awareness by exploring the depth of our ego. We got to be self-aware. I think more so now in this era of humanity, more so than any other era, we really have to be self-aware. And then, of course, I also want to enhance our intuition, let go of the urge to compare ourselves to others, and then celebrate our individual paths and experience. What else are my intentions? I think those pretty good intentions for today. So let's talk about the ego. What is the ego? What is ego? Well, ego is the thinking mind, or in most of our cases, the overthinking mind. The ego is that thing that it creates characteristics and traits of fear, anger, resentment, insecurity. I mean, these are all egotistical traits and characteristics. Control. It also defends our wounded and unhealed inner child. So, in that regards, it also makes us a little defensive and overprotective of our feelings. Now, most people think the ego is something that is displayed only when you're feeling inflated. Vanity is a trait of the ego. Vanity, what do they call it? Not necessarily self-love, because that's something completely different. But vanity is also a trait of it, and that can be a good or bad thing. But the ego is not always inflated; it can also be deflated as well. So the ego, it does distance us from our own inherent spiritual connection. When the ego is in play, it can sometimes hinder us from connecting authentically to where we should be spiritually. It also leads us to measure ourselves against others. It leads us to compare ourselves. And I got this from a course that I recently took. So I do want to let you know this is a quote. I may be paraphrasing, but ego, she said in the course, I believe, is the killer of joy. There's nothing worse than comparing yourself, and that happens all the time, especially when you're on social media. Um, and we don't get to see what happens outside of those recordings or those videos or what that person may be going through in real life. What we do see, though, is what we are presented with on social media. And I'm not saying it's a false presentation or representation, but it's not always the full representation. And so we find ourselves comparing ourselves. And maybe even outside of social media with our friends and our families where we think that we should be in certain places in our lives or certain certain aspects of our lives we should be or should have already improved upon. That's when we start to compare ourselves. So basically the ego, it notices the difference between us and others and separates us from our divine connection, forgetting that we're all connected. It becomes wounded, it takes things personally. Oh my God, that's me completely in, but it makes us human. It does block our intuition, and it compares us to making us feel like we're not good enough. Like I said, it can become inflated, and it can become deflated. And I want to kind of go back to where I said taking things personally. The ego will take the slightest thing personally. I'm going to give you a personal anecdote of what I was experiencing when I decided to have a ego death ritual for myself in recognition of what my next phase was in my healing journey. Before that, normally on my birthday, I try to have something big, and I always get like really disappointed when people don't show up or they don't call or, to that effect. And I take it personal. I always, it's always like one of those things like, oh, they don't like me, they aren't my real friends. And I'm not gonna lie, it's disappointing, rejection or when you're disregarded, it can be a very disappointing feeling. And you take it personally. And then when you find out things like, there was an illness, there was a death, or, maybe the person just couldn't afford to, you know, go out to your birthday dinner, or maybe something happened, or and quite frankly, we're human. Maybe you just forgot. But the ego makes you see things differently. It makes you feel like you are not important to that person, or that person doesn't care. That's the ego. That person's never said that to you. They've never presented themselves in that way. That is just your ego making you believe things that you want to believe is true to justify your feelings. So, like I said, it does make us overly sensitive and hinders our intuition. It prompts us to compare ourselves to other, and of course, and that results in feelings of inadequacy. Of course, and again, I think I mentioned this more than once, inflated self-worth, which we kind of see a lot of, and that self-worth can also turn into control. We're starting to see that a lot just in terms of the entertainment industry and things of that nature. So anyway, the ego is very complex, but yet very simple. It is just really one of those things, your thinking mind and how we process our feelings and emotions. Now, again, how do you identify your ego? Like, how do you know your ego has come into play? Well, you have heightened emotional states. You seek justification, even though you know some of your actions aren't justified. You seek it. You're defensive or easily offended by something that someone says. I mean, you would always say, "Oh, I'm open to constructive criticism," but yet you're still defended or offended by it, or you try to offend it. So that's another way you know your ego is coming to play. Certain ideologies that you might have that you don't want to let go of because you feel not necessarily that they're right or justified. It's just that that's how you grew up. Those are things that you've been taught, and those are things that you are taught to believe, no matter what is proven to show that this might be not be a valid ideology, you still hold on to those values. It could be, cultural reasons, family reasons, but the ego shows up in certain ideologies that you have. Reaction and responsiveness, which is something that I personally have struggled with my entire life. And I've noticed that, as we all learn that we're interconnected, that we all also struggle through how we react and respond. Reactionary responses, for example, as a young adult, it's basically your fight or flight mode. You're either gonna fight through it, or you're gonna free yourself from it. You're gonna run from it. You never really find that happy medium. But when you dissolve the ego, there's a common place in between that fight or flight response, that react or response, that makes you really rethink everything. Um, it's a very telling process, and if you want to dive more, this is the podcast. I don't want to give away everything because a lot of the things that I have learned throughout this process is something that you would want to kind of sit either one on one or join a workshop. So I'm just going to give you the gist today, and then if you run across some other podcasts or other groups, I definitely highly recommend that you join and educate yourself a little bit more on what the ego dissolution is, or the ego death, ego drop, however you want to call it. All of it means the same. But I definitely encourage you to dig a little deeper, dive a little more into this particular process. So again, those are just a few of the ways, though, however you can identify when your ego was in place. When you find yourself in a fight or flight position, that is your ego, and it's only giving you two choices, but there's more than just those two choices. All right, so um, here's a couple of ways that you can drop your ego. Some of it can be a little interesting, a little challenging, a little fun, but I'm gonna give you a few exercises. And I'm sharing this information, so I don't want to seem too scripted. I'm sharing this information based off the presentation I had through our healing circle. So if you came to the healing circle, you're kind of hearing this over again in a sense. If you're new to this is what you missed in the healing circle, and this is what, kind of just bringing it to the podcast. So one of the things that, one of the exercises you can do to dissolve the ego in itself is name your ego. Now, this allows you to remember you are not these stories that you tell yourself. But you got to identify these ego stories too. So the ego can tell you stories that when you believe a certain story, this is how you react. Anyway, so let me back up. Let's start with the identify your ego by name. Give it a name. Beyonce had like a Sasha Fierce. I don't know if that was like her that was her alter ego as opposed to her true ego. I think Janet Jackson had like Demita Joe. I know that was like more of on an entertainment level, but that's just to give you an idea. Like, I'm not going to tell you my ego's name, but I gave my ego a name so that when I did have my ego death ritual, I could give her a proper obituary. Identify your ego stories. All of our egos, we all have these different stories, and our ego tells us stories like, I'm not worthy of love. I'm not worthy of a good job. I'm not worthy of. That's what your ego tells you. That's not your reality. That is your ego speaking and telling you you're not worthy of certain things that you desire. Um, your ego also tells you stories that they says things to you like other people are doing better at this than I am, or other people are living this better life than I am. Again, that's your ego talking because we don't know what's going on the other side of what you're seeing or what's being presented to you. The ego also tells you things like I should be further along in my business, in my healing, in my finances, in my love life. The ego is telling you that you should be further along, but in reality, you might. I'm not saying if you're like super broke and you're mismanaging your money, that's where you need to be. No, that's some things you have to look at outside of the ego. But if you're doing the very best that you can and you are establishing yourself, there's no time frame on where you need to be in comparison to where someone else is in their life. So again, that's the ego telling you that you should be further along. Now the ego will tell you things I'm not as attractive as other people my age. That is the ego telling you that. Nobody's said that to you. Self-esteem, how we look and how we feel outwardly, physically to everybody else is not. I always tell my husband funny thing. I always because he'll come to me and he'll bring me like a picture. He goes, "I want to buy this outfit for you. What do you think about this?" And I look at him and go, "Who do you think you know?" What makes you think I would wear that? Or what makes you think, because I don't feel or I can't see myself in that sort of outfit or that sort of whatever. But when he looks at me, that's all he sees something completely different. That's the ego. And, that could also be other mental health issues. And I know people are going to kind of dive into that. But based on just the ego, the smaller part of it, the ego will tell you those types of stories. And those stories aren't your truth. Your ego stories are not your truth. All right, so, and then of course, once you identify those stories that your ego has been telling you, you want to release those ego stories. You want to release those. You want to let go. You don't want that to be your story. You want to create your own, and that's when you have to let the ego go. That's when you have to release your ego. And now just releasing those stories, releasing yourself from your ego. I did a ritual. I'm not saying this is for everybody, but I did a ritual. I continue to do rituals. It's not just something that I do just once and I never do it again. Of course, it always includes all the things that heighten you and heighten your vibrations spiritually. Meditation. There are meditations specifically out there for the ego death, and I will try to link some of those in. You will find those. I don't know how I'm going to link it into the actual end of the podcast, probably in the notes or bio somewhere. But if you go to our healing circle through Healing Eyes Healing Circle, you can find it through the Facebook page. We'll have this actual presentation that I did during the podcast, and then we'll also have it uploaded for you to be able to have access to some of the key um, cards in here so that you can use it for your own benefit if you like. But as I was saying, you want to take an opportunity to just kind of dissolve the ego. Don't overthink things. Stop comparing yourself to other people. Don't let your mind, your ego, the thinking mind, the overthinking mind tell you things that aren't true. Don't make vast assumptions. I think when you take your ego out of the situation and you see things for what they actually are, you'll find yourself, you'll come to appreciate yourself a lot more, and you'll come to understand yourself a lot more. As I mentioned earlier, self-awareness is so important when you're healing because you have to take responsibility for your actions. So the ego death itself, once you dissolve your ego, again, remove that aspect of your thinking mind where you're comparing, you're degrading. And once you can remove that from your everyday practice, and that can also be through affirmations along with meditation, your spiritual enlightenment will be enhanced. I can definitely tell you that because then you can dive into the shadow work. And the shadow work is something that we'll talk about in a future episode. But once you open yourself to be vulnerable, that shadow work, which I think for me was the most challenging in my healing journey, is to be able to acknowledge my actions and reactions. A part again, that's also a part of dropping the ego. But you can once you do that ego dissolve, you can go into that shadow work, which takes you further into your healing because now you're not just putting um, the responsibility on others or your circumstances or your environment, you're actually taking accountability. I think the shadow work is probably the most challenging aspect of healing, but it is a necessary step, just like dissolving the ego is a very necessary step. All right, so I did want to share that. I hope you guys, gain some insight on the ego death. I hope I didn't miss anything. Um, I did share that I did an ego death ritual, and basically, what I did was on my 55th birthday, which was September 28th, I had named my ego. I wrote down some of the stories, my ego stories. So be sure to, again, write those ego stories down. Don't just put them in your mind. I want you to see them. I want you to feel them. I want you to sit with them. Write that ego stories down, those ego stories down again, just to kind of go over those ego stories again. The ego stories tells you things like, I'm not worthy of. Why does your ego tell you that? Where did you get that from? Has anyone ever told you that? What was your assumption? Where did that ideal come from? You will find that some of these things, your ego in itself comes from trauma. It comes from your inner wounded child. Remember, I said it earlier in the podcast that the ego protects that wounded inner child. You might have to dig a little deeper. You might have a conversation with that wounded inner child and find out what makes you feel that you're not worthy of. What happened? Um, I mentioned this in I think last week's podcast where when I was younger, my mother would pinch my nose, and I did find out this is something that other women have done. So I don't want to just pinpoint that as like my mother was the only person that did that. Apparently, it was something that mothers did, and that was just a sign of times. You know what I mean? We were, you want to keep in mind, and I'm not going to get off political and social. For the African American community, my particular generation, Generation X, were the first free generation. So we are having to overcome a lot of stereotypes, a lot of ideologies, a lot of practices that no longer serve us in this society anymore. And so in doing so, we're going to have to break some of those generational curses that might not be applicable to every culture or every race because we had very special circumstances. So to bring you back to the story I was sharing, I think I shared this in my previous podcast, is my mother would pinch the end of my nose to make it a little pointier. And this would be what we would call colorism and classism in a sense, and within the African American community, because that pointier, straighter European type nose would be assumed would have me associated with a more accepted culture within the Black community. And again, that's a whole different concept, a whole different content that we could talk about on another podcast or possibly on another show, not on this platform. But I just want to give you an idea and sharing this story. So she would pinch nose. We'd be driving down the street. My mother would grab my nose and she would pinch it. Or we'd be sitting somewhere and she would grab my nose and pinch it. She would give me instructions and say, go hold your nose. It's kind of like being a timeout for me for like 5 minutes, just so I could reshape or what she thought somebody told her was how you reshape the nose. Now, as fast forward, I get older, I am now terribly self-conscious about the width and size of my nose. I felt ugly. I felt, oh my God, why is this person even dating me? My nose was the forefront. I would hide it. I just never felt comfortable about that. But again, the ego can be inflated and it can also be deflated. It was this weird sort of dynamics with my ego because, of course, I was attractive to other people. People were attracted to me despite what I felt about my nose. In my 55 years, I've never, ever had anyone say, you have a big nose. That's all in my head. And never have I ever had anyone say that. Have I looked at pictures and went, ooh, yeah, I mean, we all have those pictures where, depending on where you're positioned, your face may be a little distorted in some areas than others. But my ego and that child who had been embarrassed to share her nose or was self-conscious because my mother would pinch it, it developed into some sort of really hidden trauma and just a story that I would tell myself. And removing that, and that's just one of the simplest anecdotes that I could tell you. That's not even as deep as some of the stuff goes, but just want to give you an idea of how silly that was, how very childish and how silly the ego can be. But that was that ego protecting that child who felt uncomfortable with that sort of process. And again, like I said, I was the only one, my mother was the only parent to do that. So I'm not trying to put shame on her, but it is something that a lot of us in the African American experience, particularly maybe within my family dynamics that we experienced over the years, growing into our culture. Right now, I noticed that another one of the ego stories that a lot of people are telling themselves today is that, we should be further along because we're watching social media. Social media has a dramatic and traumatic effect on us on almost a daily basis because we're being told and spoken to in so many variety of ways. We're being told, well, if you're this age, you should be doing this, and if you're this age, you shouldn't be doing that. No one can tell you what your story is or where you should be within your story, but you. Now, if you don't like the dynamics that you're in, not because your ego tells you so, maybe it's because it's not comfortable, you're not getting your privacy, you're not, you just don't have the freedoms or whatever the situation may be. This is the way you get there is to manifest those things, is to make those things happen. But if you're unhealed, all that hard work you're putting into trying to build this spiritual practice of manifesting, setting your intentions, and doing those really great things, it's going to be challenging. I don't want to ever say it's impossible because I've seen manifestation work at its finest for me and my family, and how we set our intentions and things come to us because we are aware of our blessings and we're grateful for everything that we have. But that healing process is so important to really be able to be our higher selves. So anyway, so today that was a topic on just the ego drop in. If you have any questions, you want to dive deeper, or you want to be a part of the healing circles, be sure to go to our social media. Make sure you join some of the platforms so that you can be informed when we have our healing circles. Healing circles, though, just to let you know, I'm going to be hosting healing circles starting December 20th, I believe, is when we're going to November 20th, I'm sorry, not December 20th, November 20th, we're going to start launching weekly healing circles at 6 p.m. It will be live, it will be Zoom, so we'll be able to see each other's faces, support ourselves within our community. We have these discussions where you can ask those really important questions and we can really get them answered. Sometimes you miss some things in the podcast because you don't want to overwhelm or overstay your time within the podcast. I want you to be able to tune in and listen and really gain some insight and information from what I'm saying. So, but if you want to go in depth, you can definitely do that through Healing Eyes, through our groups. I'm also available for one-on-one consultations if you'd like to, discuss this a little deeper, talk about some ego dissolve rituals that you can do. Get with me one-on-one. My email address is Tony, Toni, at throughhealingeyes.com. Again, that's TONI at throughhealingeyes.com, Through Healing Eyes all together. You can also send emails to staff at throughhealingeyes.com, and if I don't get back to you, someone will. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and wrap up. I'm going to try to keep these podcasts down to 30 minutes. Like I said, you live and learn. Part of the healing process is to be able to evolve. So when you're healing, you learn, you evolve, and as you evolve, you grow. And like I said, I want this podcast to grow into everything that it can be, so that it can reach more people, and we can heal. We can help with the healing process of many others. Before I go, I also want to drop a few other things before I go. If you follow us on Facebook, last week we did talk about family healing, family curses, family trauma. I do have a workbook now available. It's called Healing Heritage. It's available to help you kind of work through healing, working through healing traumas or family traumas and generational curses. I love this workbook. It's been really a big thing for me to be able to kind of dive into some of the exercises and challenge myself with some of the questions and just kind of get an idea of how impactful uh, generational curses have been towards me. I think this is really going to be helpful. So it is available now on Barnes and Nobles. Please reach out to me if you have any questions. Or again, you can visit us through our social media pages and get the link and purchase it there. All right. So until next week at 9 a.m. Pacific Standard Time, uh, I will be signing off. Again, thank you for joining me through Healing Eyes. This is your host, Harlow Hendricks, aka Tony Shannon. Anyway, you know how it goes. Those pseudonyms, gotta have one for something. Anyway, this is your girl, Harlow Hendricks. Until next time, wishing you lots of love, peace, joy, and happiness.